Yes, okay, so it started. Good evening, everyone. Myself, Gaurav Kumawat, coordinator of IBEC. And for the third talk of IBEC APHD Talk Series, which is a talk series by the pursuers of Doctorate of Philosophy from leading institutions, today we have with us Mr. Prasada. Welcome, sir. Before we start with the talk, I would like to give a short introduction of Sir. So, he is a PhD scholar from the Department of Physics, IISER Bhopal. He is also a recipient of the prestigious Inspires Fellowship. He is an alumnus of Loyola College, Chennai, and the Department of Theoretical Physics, University of Madras. For his MSc project, he worked on exact emission from the BTZ black hole. His current research interest lies in compact stars, which are neutron stars, quark stars, and black holes, and the gravitational waves. He currently performs general relativistic hydrodynamics simulations to model some of the interesting astrophysical phenomena associated with compact stars, with a primary focus on quark hadron phase transition, binary merger, and supernova collapse. And today he will be giving a talk titled Probing the Compact Stars with Ripples in Space-Time. We will be having the Q&A session at the end of the talk. So you can keep posting your questions in the chat box and we will take note of those questions. And now I welcome Sir to take over from here.
Yeah. So I'll be introducing you to the world of compact stars and gravitational waves through this talk. And so I'll begin my talk from here. First, I will introduce what are compact stars and what are the interesting properties of these compact stars, and then what is Einstein's general theory of relativity, and then how gravitational waves come as a prediction from this theory, and how with using the gravitational waves, which are ripples in space-time, we can probe the compact stars. That will be the whole thing which I will cover. So let me begin. So what is a star? The stars are formed in our universe in the giant gas clouds that we have called as the nebula. Nebula are region in our universe in which we have gas clouds. In these gas clouds, there is a lot of hydrogen and helium, and in these gas clouds, the star formation happens. The gas clouds which we see in our universe, uh, due to the gravitational force, the molecules of the gas clouds try to come together and form some lumps, and the cloud of gas contracts under its own gravity. When it contracts under its own gravity, the gas molecules move together, due to which the temperature and pressure rises. When the temperature and pressure rises among the gas molecule, it initiates nuclear reactions there. The hydrogen and the helium gas molecules which are moving inside this gas cloud will start to collide with each other, and there's enough temperature and pressure now such that the hydrogen and hydrogen will combine together to form helium, and some heavy elements can formation will take place here, and thus we get a star which is in equilibrium. The gravitational collapse which was happening due to its own gravity is now balanced by the radiation pressure and also by the gas pressure of this hydrogen gas which is there, and due to which the star is in complete equilibrium now, and the star glows for years and years in this phase, and it has reached a phase called as the main sequence star like our sun. So, say a cloud of gas which was contracting under its own gravity led to temperature and pressure rise, due to which nuclear reaction started inside it, and the star attains a equilibrium phase where the pressure and gravity is in balance, and it remains in this phase for millions of years till there is nuclear process going on inside it. That is, hydrogen and hydrogen is getting converted into helium, and the nuclear processes keep going. The radiation pressure due to the photons being produced, and there's a gas pressure is also has increased, which balances the gravitational force of that complete gas cloud, and we get a spherical shaped star in which the gravity and the pressure is in balance, and it glows forever and ever for millions of years, just like our sun. So what happens to it after it has started glowing is something that is very interesting. So as I told, we have a stellar nebula, gas clouds in the universe where stars are getting formed, and once equilibrium is attained between pressure and gravity, the star is a glowing ball where nuclear processes are going on. At one point of time, all the hydrogen in the star will get converted into helium, and there will be no further reaction happening. For example, in our sun, the hydrogen gets converted to helium, and then element formation happens up to carbon. After that, there is no element formation happens in our sun-like star. Those average size star undergoes a red giant phase. The red giant phase, their outer layer expands, and at one point of time, that outer layer goes away, and then we get a small compact star called as the white dwarf. In the white dwarf star which is formed, here, as I told, in the sun, the gas pressure and the radiation pressure is balancing the gravity. But in the white dwarf, what is balancing the gravity is something called as electron degeneracy pressure. Because whenever you want an equilibrium configuration, the gravitational force has to be balanced by some pressure. In the case of the sun, that is balanced by the radiation pressure and the gas pressure. In the case of the white dwarf star, which is formed at the end, it is balanced by the electron degeneracy pressure. How the electrons come out of the atom is in the sense that when the star is collapsing due to its own gravity, sun-like stars, the atoms get completely squeezed, and the electrons come out of the atom, and they are freely roaming inside the gas cloud, and we get a electron gas, and that electron gas degeneracy pressure provides the balancing force against the gravity, and we get an equilibrium configuration called as a white dwarf. And after this remains as it is. But in this white dwarf, there is no particular nuclear reaction happening now. So there is no heat is produced, or there is no photons are produced now, because there is no nuclear burning happening now. But whatever temperature it had attained, it loses it for millions of years in the coming ahead once it is formed. Only that particular heat which it is losing now and cooling down, only that we can detect from Earth. There is no nuclear process happening inside this white dwarf as it is happening with the sun here. So there are some stars which are quite massive than our sun, 10 times massive than sun, or 20 times massive than sun. Those particular stars, inside them, as I told, hydrogen gets converted to helium, and the element formation keeps occurring. And at one particular point, the element formation occurs up to iron. After that, there is no further element formation in those kind of stars. So that stars, when the complete gas converts up to iron, hydrogen became helium, then helium became carbon, carbon became slowly up to iron. After that, there is no further nuclear reaction happening. Then those stars undergo a red supergiant phase, and then they undergo supernova explosion, in which their outer layer expands and completely bursts away, and then the remaining inner core, up to which was the iron core which was left, that contracts, and then they may become a neutron star, or it can become a black hole. So the white dwarfs, neutron star, and black holes are called as compact stars, because the big stars of 1-2 solar mass, or 10 solar mass, 20 solar mass, 30 solar mass have ended up their life into very small objects like the white dwarf or the neutron star or the black hole. The black hole, the neutron star which gets formed at the end, it is balanced by the neutron degeneracy pressure and the strong force, because as I told, the gravity has to get balanced by some pressure. In the case of neutron star, it is neutron degeneracy pressure and also the strong force, and it is in equilibrium. And a neutron star's typical size is only 15 kilometer, and it can have masses up to 1.4 solar mass, 2 solar mass, and all that. So imagine 2 times the mass of sun present only in 15 kilometers. How dense this star can be, the neutron star. And white dwarf is also a very compact star. So it will be as the size of the Earth, but it will have mass up that of the sun. For example, sun's 1 solar mass is, if you completely squeeze it into the size of the Earth, then you can imagine how dense this white dwarf will be. Its density will be that high, and it will be up to the size of Earth. It will be that sized. A neutron star will be only 15 kilometer in size, but you can see that the complete sun's mass, 1 solar mass or 2 solar mass, 1 or 2 times the mass of sun is completely squeezed into a 15 kilometer ball. So it will be extremely dense. And black hole is formed when the electron degeneracy pressure, the neutron degeneracy pressure, or the other things are not strong enough to hold on to the final remnant. After supernova explosion has happened, the remnant, whatever is left, after the outer layer has went away, the core, whatever is left, if that is balanced by neutron degeneracy pressure and strong force, we'll get a neutron star. If that is not able to get balanced, then that will lead to complete collapse, and we'll get a black hole. So these are called as compact stars: white dwarf, neutron star, and black hole. So all the stars start their life from a cloud of gas. They reach a main sequence phase where there is a glowing gas ball where nuclear reaction is going, light is emitted, photons are coming. You can see it in the visible band, you can see it in ultraviolet, you can see it in infrared, and those things. Once it runs out of nuclear reaction, there is no more. Then the gravity cannot get balanced, because the nuclear reaction, when it was happening, the photons were emitted, and there were gas pressure also which was balancing the gravity. Now that is not happening. So they get into a red giant phase, and after the red giant phase, they will end up the compact star. and the compact star which are formed, the masses of them depend upon the initial star through which it is born. If the initial star is less massive, it may become a white dwarf. If initial star are very, very massive, it may become a neutron star or a black hole. Is I'm audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. So now what is a white dwarf? The white dwarf star is formed if the initial star's mass is 8 solar mass. If the initial star, which is the main sequence star which is there, if its mass is less than 8 solar mass, then at the end of the life we will get a white dwarf. And the balancing force for a white dwarf which is formed is electron degeneracy pressure. And then we also have a Chandrasekhar limit which states that the electron degeneracy pressure can maximum balance a 1.4 solar mass remnant. It may start with a 5 solar mass star or a 6 solar mass star, but at the end when the outer layer expands and goes away, the remnant which is left, if the remnant is below 1.4 solar mass, then electron degeneracy pressure will balance it and we'll get a white dwarf. So we can have a white dwarf of 1 solar mass, 1.2 solar mass, 1.4 solar mass, but we can never have a white dwarf star which is of 2 solar mass. 1.4 solar mass is the maximum mass limit which a white dwarf can have, because electron degeneracy pressure can balance only up to that amount. So white dwarfs can be only up to this much. So some theoretical studies have suggested that if the initial star is less than 8 solar mass, then they will end up in white dwarf. And the size of the white dwarf star is, they will be massive as a sun because it is 1.4 solar mass or 1 solar mass or something like that, and they will be bigger as size of the Earth. That is, complete mass of sun is put into a Earth size. So they will be very dense. The densities will be 10 power 11 gram per centimeter cube. This much dense these stars will be. Much denser than our sun they will be. So this is a small artistic description where this is our sun, and when it will become a red giant phase, its outer layer will expand, that is shown in the middle, and after the outer layer expands and goes away, then the remnant compact core which is left, that becomes the white dwarf. So that is shown here. Sun is of this size, and when it becomes white dwarf, it becomes a compact star. Compact is all the mass is now confined. Most of the mass was in the core now is confined in a smaller radius, and the radius of white dwarf star is up to that of the Earth. So after formation, the white dwarf cools down to millions and millions of years, and we can see them in ultraviolet and X-ray band. Since there is no nuclear reaction happening inside them, we cannot see it in the visible light, the photons and all that things. So now neutron stars are pulsars. So if the initial star was up to from 8 to 14 solar times the mass of sun, if the initial star which was undergoing nuclear reaction, if that was up to 8 to 14 times the mass of the sun, then they will end up in becoming a neutron star. And due to the extreme squeezing of matter, the neutrons present in the nucleus starts coming out, and that happens when the density is above 4.3 into 10 power 11 gram centimeter cube. As I told, when a star of suppose 10 solar mass or 11 solar mass, when it has burnt out its complete fuel, hydrogen helium fuel, and it has reached and up to iron has got formed inside it, at that particular stage there is no further nuclear burning. It will start collapsing due to its own gravity, because there is no gas pressure, radiation pressure, and due to the squeezing of the matter, when the density becomes above this particular value, 4.3 into 10 power 11 gram per cc, the neutrons which are present inside the nucleus starts coming out of the nucleus, and we get a sea of neutrons, and thus we get a neutron star. And this neutron star is balanced by neutron degeneracy pressure and strong force. And the size of them will be massive as sun, but only 15 kilometer in radius. For example, we are sitting now in Izar. From Izar to the Bhopal distance, in that 15 kilometer size, you are completely putting the sun's whole mass. 1 times the mass of sun or 2 times the mass of sun. 1 solar mass or 2 solar mass, neutron star means you are putting 1 times the mass of sun or 2 times the mass of sun in a 15 kilometer radius. You can think how dense that particular neutron star will be. And the densities are 10 to power 15 gram per centimeter cube, which is seen in the neutron stars. And the maximum mass limit for them, theoretically, we don't know what is the exact mass limit. For a white dwarf, we know it is 1.4 solar mass, but for neutron star, we don't know the exact mass limit, because the matter at this particular densities, we don't really understand them. What particular matter it is and what particular pressure it can hold, we don't understand it completely. So there are some theoretical works. Some say 2.4 solar mass can be the maximum neutron star mass. Some studies say it can be 3 solar mass. So it is something between 2.5 to 3 solar mass. As of now, we exactly don't know. In future, we will get to know. And this neutron star don't emit any optical light, because there also no nuclear process is going on. It is the end product where nuclear process couldn't happen and it contracted and it has become a neutron star. So this also don't emit in particular in optical light or the visible band. So in the neutron stars, we usually see in radio and X-ray emission, that I will tell how in the next slide. So what are the properties we can expect from neutron star? Here I have provided some rough estimate. We know the conservation of angular momentum, which says that the initial angular momentum will be equal to the final angular momentum, which you would have studied in school or in your undergraduate course now. So the angular momentum formula is I omega. So the initial angular momentum will be initial moment of inertia into initial angular frequency, and the final angular momentum will be final moment of inertia and final angular frequency. And we can put for a rotating ball what is the value of moment of inertia, 2 by 5 mr square. That is the value which is substituted here, and we just do some calculation, and it says that the final frequency will be initial frequency, and that will be related to Ri Rf by square. So it says that if the star's radius is decreasing, then its frequency has to increase. As I told, initially we had a 10 or 14 solar mass star, and then it became a compact star, the neutron star. So in the neutron star, what property we can expect? Its radius is smaller than the initial star. The initial star will be hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, but the neutron star is only 15 kilometers. So we expect that the neutron star will be very rapidly orbiting now, because the angular frequency will be high. The spin frequency has to increase if radius decreases, because initial radius was high and the final radius is small. Final radius is only 15 kilometers. Initial radius was some hundreds of kilometers. So we omega f will be higher than the omega I. So we expect the star to be rotating very fast, the neutron star which is formed. So the neutron star should be rapidly rotating stars. This is one property we expect from theory, basic theory. Another small approximation what we can do is that we can see the conservation of magnetic flux. Magnetic flux is magnetic field into surface area. If we say magnetic flux is conserved, then initial magnetic flux should be equal to the final magnetic flux. That is Bi magnetic flux into surface area 4 pi Ri square Bf into 4 pi Rf square, where this is the initial magnetic flux, this is the final magnetic flux. If you do some simple calculation, we get that Bf is equal to final magnetic field is equal to initial magnetic field, and it is Ri by Rf square. So we know that the initial final neutron star which is formed is a compact star. Its radius is smaller than the final radius is smaller than the initial radius. So when we do this particular part, it comes out that the magnetic field of the neutron star will be much higher than the initial star. So if initial star had a weak magnetic field, the neutron star which is got formed at the end should have a high magnetic field, because it is compact in size, so its magnetic field has to be higher. Because Rf is small, Ri was big, so Bf has to be bigger than Bi. So with these small rough estimates, we can know that a neutron star which got formed should have a high angular velocity, that is should be rapidly rotating, and also it should have very strong magnetic field. This is what theory told. And do we get the same thing as in observation? Yes, we do get it. The neutron stars were first predicted. The neutron stars were first predicted theoretically in 1930s itself, but their observation came in the year 1967, 50 years after they were firstly predicted. And this neutron star, once a PhD student and their guide was studying the radio signals coming from in the radio telescope, and they saw continuously there was a particular kind of signal which was repeatedly they were getting it, and they couldn't understood it. And then later that signal came out to be a radio signal which is emitted by a rotating neutron star. So in neutron star, I told it is rapidly rotating, and also it has a magnetic field. So you can see the magnetic field line shown here, and this is rotation axis, this is its magnetic field axis. So when a neutron star is rotating and its magnetic field is not aligned with the rotation, then through the magnetic field axis you will get radio emission. That is the photons which are the electrons which are present in the surface, they get accelerated along these magnetic field lines, and then they emit photons in radio, and that radio emission we receive on Earth. And that radio emission, since it is orbiting, whenever it faces our Earth, we will get the emission. Whenever it is not facing that, we will not get the emission. So continuously after 1 millisecond, there was a radio emission which they were continuously receiving, and that came to be from that of a neutron star. So neutrons are called as pulsars because they are rapidly rotating, and we get pulse of radio emission from them which is emitted along the magnetic axis. And the neutron star first was observed in November 28, 1967. Till after that, we have seen a lot of neutron stars, and that is shown here. In this plot, what is shown is in the x-axis we have period. What is the spin period of the neutron star? And here we have p dot. what P dot is how much is the spin period changing. So this is a neutron star which is orbiting, which is rotating, and it has a magnetic field. Anything which has a magnetic field and which is rotating will lose its energy because of emission. And the same thing happens in the neutron star also. They continuously lose energy and the spin period keeps changing, and that is what is shown here. The y-axis has spin period change and the x-axis has its spin period. And these are the different neutron stars, whatever data we have got. Because from the neutron star we get only the radio pulses. So the data what we get is what is its period and how much the period is changing over the time, and that is the plot. So whenever the spin period becomes smaller than this particular value, here you can see this death line which is visible. When the neutron star spin value and the spin period change value is in this particular region, they don't emit pulses which reaches our Earth. So this particular part is called as the graveyard of neutron star, which we cannot see. So once they are here, we can observe them. Once we are here, we observe them. But if their period and their period change, P dot, if it is here, we don't see them. This particular region is called as graveyard. We never found any pulsar which is located in this particular region. So this is about neutron star, one of the compact stars which I told. So other compact star, what I told is black hole. And the black hole is formed if the initial star, which what I told, if that is above 14 solar mass, then we get a black hole. If it is from 8 to 14 solar mass, we will get a neutron star. If it is above 14 solar mass, the end product of the initial star which is undergoing a nuclear reaction, it will end up to a black hole. And in a black hole, the gravity is so strong and the matter has squeezed into a very tiny space, because there is no particular balancing force due to electron degeneracy pressure, neutron degeneracy pressure. There is no particular agent which can balance it. So the complete matter undergoes a full collapse and it completely gets squeezed into a tiny space. Also from the black hole, the light also cannot escape and they are invisible. And we have seen black holes of various masses, but we feel the black hole masses can be from 4 to some few tenths of solar mass, that is 4 to 50 solar mass, 4 to 60 or 4 to 70. There are supermassive black holes also which we see at our center of our galaxy, but they are about 10 power 6 solar mass. But those are not end product of the stars. Stellar mass black holes are those black holes which are formed at the end of life of a star which has run out of fuel. When it is collapses, those black holes which are formed at the end, those black holes are called as stellar mass black holes, and they are usually from 4 to few tenths of solar mass in size, in mass, in terms of mass. And since the black holes are not visible, how do we see them? A black hole structure is shown here, theoretical structure, what we know from the works of Einstein and others. And a black hole will have a singularity at the center, and there will be a region around it called as the event horizon. So if anything enters into this event horizon, it cannot escape out of the black hole. Event horizon is the boundary around the black hole, and at singularity is the point at the center of the black hole. And the distance between the singularity and the event horizon is called as the Schwarzschild radius. This is what we know from theory. If any light signal enters into this event horizon, then it will not come out. And this is just an artistic description. We cannot see the black hole through our eyes, but how do we see a black hole? How do the scientists see a black hole? The way they see the black hole is that they notice the behavior of the other stars around the black hole or the accretion disk around the black hole. Suppose you have a black hole here at this particular diagram, and there was a nearby star. The matter falling from the nearby star into the black hole will create a disk around it called as the accretion disk, because the matter is getting accreted slowly and it is falling onto the black hole. So from this disk will start glowing, and it will give some emission due to heating up. And from that disk emission, we can come to know that inside there is a black hole which is to which the matter is falling, and there is a disk around it. So by the indirect effect, we get to know that there is a black hole which is existing there. In some cases, the black hole will not be sucking the mass from the nearby star, but the nearby star will orbit around a completely dark object, and that we come to know there is a black hole there. So now another compact star that we can have is a quark star, which is a quark star is theoretically possible, but there is no observation of it yet. And how a quark star can be there is that, as I told, that a neutron star is formed when the neutrons present inside the nucleus drip out of the nucleus, and there is a sea of neutrons present inside the star. We get a neutron star. As we know that inside the neutrons there are 3 quarks. The up quarks, down quarks are present inside the neutrons. So when these quarks which are present inside the neutrons get deconfined, and then we have a sea of up and down quarks, then we get a quark star. So quark stars are theoretically possible. There are hypotheses as of now. There is no observational evidence, but the dripping out of quarks from the neutrons can happen if the densities are about 10 power 15 gram per cc, and the balancing force for a quark star to be completely be in equilibrium against the gravity is the quark matter pressure. So a quark star is theoretically possible. Its observation is yet to be done, and we don't know when we will be able to see it. But as of now, we have seen the compact stars, white dwarf. We have observational evidence for neutron star. We have observational evidence for black hole, but we don't have any observational evidence for quark star. And this is something which I am working also. That how can we observe the quark star? And my work deals with my work deals with conversion of neutron star to quark star, and what will be the observational signatures when a neutron star becomes a quark star. That's the research which I do. So now I will introduce to something different now. So I have introduced you to what are the compact star, the neutron star, white dwarf, black hole, and the quark star. And as I told that the white dwarfs emit in some different wavelength, neutron stars emit in some different wavelength, black holes don't emit anything, but the disks around it give some emission, and quark stars we don't have any observation. And they're the visible stars like our sun. They emit in ultraviolet, they emit in visible, they also emit in infrared, and those kind of wavelength. So we have various telescopes which are present on our Earth. Some are located on the Earth, the terrestrial telescopes. Some are present in the space. The gamma ray and the X-ray telescopes are located in the satellites because the gamma ray and X-ray cannot penetrate into our Earth's atmosphere, and we cannot receive them. So the gamma ray and X-ray telescopes are located at the space, but the visible, ultraviolet, infrared telescopes are located both on space and both on Earth, both the places for the visible infrared. But the gamma ray and X-ray ones are located only on the space. So some particular stars will be emitting in all these different wavelengths, and by studying all the different wavelengths, for example, our sun emits in 3 or 4 wavelengths, and the disk around the black hole, it will emit in X-ray, ultraviolet, visible, infrared, in all these wavelengths. And by studying all these wavelengths will give us information in different wavelengths. And so this kind of astronomy has gained some momentum, and it is called as multi-wavelength astronomy, where we observe a same source in different wavelengths. Different telescopes will be taking data in different wavelengths. We combine together that, and we'll get different interpretations and different processes which are going inside the star or any celestial process which is going there. So now, so this was the common mode. The Galileo used a simple optical telescope, and different people have made different telescopes over the years. The gamma ray telescope, X-ray, infrared, to see the celestial objects. And now there is an era of gravitational wave astronomy which has come. What is gravitational waves and how the gravitational waves are predictions of Einstein's relativity, I'll tell now. So Einstein gave his special theory of relativity in year 1905, and in special theory of relativity is told some interesting things like time dilation will happen, mass and energy are equivalent. Time dilation happens means if you move quite fast, your time will start slowing down. This was something special which was given by Einstein's relativity in 1905. And Einstein gave his equations for general relativity in 1915, and that were also groundbreaking equations. And Einstein tried to study the precession of perihelion of Mercury. The Mercury planet, which is orbiting around the sun, its orbit precedes, and that precision he explained it using the general relativity. Also, the light which is coming from distant stars, when it passes near the sun or passes near dark matter or passes near any particular celestial object, they undergo some bending. That particular thing, Einstein proposed it, the gravitational bending of light. And also Einstein proposed gravitational redshift in the year 1916. These 3 groundbreaking things he proposed in 1916, and all were observed over the years. And also Einstein applied his general relativity equations to cosmology in the year 1917, and Einstein predicted that the universe was expanding. His equations were revealing him, but he was a firm believer that the universe is static, and he didn't wanted the universe to expand. He was such a firm believer that universe must be static that he introduced some cosmological constant in his equations, and he tried to ensure that the universe don't expand. But his equations were telling him that the universe is expanding, but he chose to believe that the universe don't expand. Over the years, scientists have worked more on this part, and now we know that the universe is expanding, and we have observations also of it. And one more, the groundbreaking thing which Einstein's equation predicted was that gravitational waves can exist. What are gravitational waves? The Einstein general theory of relativity is a theory of space-time. It says that the position coordinates x, y, t, and the time coordinate t, this complete thing are unified, and we have a space-time. which is prevailing completely in the universe. And what Einstein says is that gravity is something but which is the particular distortion of the space-time. For example, if the sun is creating a distortion in the space-time in which our earth is moving. If this is the sun, and it is present in the space-time, it creates a distortion in the space-time, and this distortion is gravity, and this distortion our earth and the other planets are moving. So that this is what was Einstein's general theory of relativity, that objects create distortion in space-time and that distortion is gravity. That's what Einstein said. And in this space-time we can have some ripples. Suppose if the sun is not static and if sun is also vibrating or sun is moving, then we will have some ripples which is created in this space-time, and those ripples are called as gravitational waves. So I will show you the simple formula which Einstein derived for gravitational wave. This is a simple formula of Einstein which he said. He said that whenever this particular quantity, double derivative of Qij, changes, gravitational wave will be emitted. This Qij is nothing but this particular value, integral of density Rij, Rj and dq bar. So what actually is that whenever the density of a system is changing or its position coordinates are changing, that is whenever there is a motion in the system or whenever there are any bodies accelerating, you will definitely get gravitational wave. This is what was Einstein's prediction. That according to this formula, whenever this quantity is non-zero, double derivative of integral of rho r, ri, rj, dq bar is not equal to 0, you will get gravitational wave. So that suggests that density of the system should change or position coordinates should change. There should be motion in the system. So gravitational waves are ripples in space-time. It can be continuous, can be short type, or it can be burst type. So what I told is that gravitational waves are ripples in space-time. They are produced whenever any body is accelerating. But these ripples can be continuous or it can be for a short duration. Two different types of gravitational wave we can have. So I will give some example of continuous gravitational wave. For example, you have a binary star system where there are two stars. The stars are orbiting about each other. And yes, we will get a gravitational wave which are ripples in space-time. We can have star which is rotating. And from a rotating star also we will get gravitational waves. There is a star which is collapsing at the supernova phase or due to any other thing. So whenever there is a collapse phase also, the density of the system is changing, the radial coordinates are changing, due to which you will get a gravitational wave. So this particular thing, when two stars are orbiting about each other, the binary system where the earth is moving around the sun or the two stars are orbiting about each other, you will get a continuous gravitational wave which will come for years and years. In the case of a rotating star, any star, you will get a continuous gravitational wave because star's rotation is continuously happening. But the collapse, which for example during the supernova phase or any other particular phase, the star undergoes collapse where when the gravity is not balanced by the internal any agent, it undergoes a collapse. That collapse starts and it lasts for some years or some milliseconds or for some hours, depending on which type of collapse it is. So those particular collapse phase also gravitational wave comes, but they will be short-lived because the collapse starts and it ends slowly. So the gravitational wave which comes from the collapse phase is burst type, but the gravitational wave which comes from inspiral phase or from a rotating star are continuous type. So how do we see the gravitational wave? In our Earth, as of now, we are having some amazing gravitational wave detectors. Two of them are there in the USA, one at Hanford and another is at Livingston. This is the image of them. The gravitational wave detectors are L-shaped as seen here, and they are located in the United States. This is a separate detector, this is a separate detector, and they can detect these ripples in space-time when they come and strike the Earth. If two stars are orbiting somewhere, it will produce gravitational waves. And when those gravitational waves comes towards our Earth, and our Earth experience these ripples in the space-time, we human beings cannot experience it because these waves are a little bit weak. Only this particular detectors can experience them. And I will tell how the detectors can observe these gravitational waves. The gravitational wave detector consists of this particular arrangement. There is a laser source from which laser is coming. There is a beam splitter. The light has been splitted in this direction, and it is splitted to go in this direction. After going and striking these mirrors, the light returns back and they again rejoin here, and we collect it here. If any gravitational wave is passing through this detector, what it will happen is that this arms are in different direction. So this particular arm will be affected differently, and this particular arm will be affected differently. And the ripples in space-time will change the distances between these arms by a very small marginal amount, and due to which the light which is returning back from this mirror and this mirror will go out of phase, and with that we detect the gravitational waves. and this arm length are 4 kilometer in length, because the gravitational waves are so weak to detect. So this arm length have been made very, very longer, so that even the minute variation in this lasers coming and striking back, any difference in this between these two arms, we can have some considerable amount of measurement. So it is kept this particular distance, like 4 kilometer. And this particular graph, what I want to tell is that this is called as a noise curve of the detector. What it says is that at this 20 hertz frequency, how much noise is present in the detector. At 100 hertz frequency, how much noise is present in the detector. At 1000 hertz frequency, how much noise. So a gravitational wave can only be seen if its signal strength is more than the noise. This is a noise curve. So at 100 hertz, if the gravitational wave is having a magnitude of 10 power minus 21, we can observe it, because the noise curve is at 10 power minus 23 at 100 hertz. So if the signal comes at 10 power minus 21, we can see it. So that's what is the whole idea. This is the noise curve of the detector, and if the signal is above this noise, we can see. If the signal is below this noise, if the signal is coming at 10 power minus 25 magnitude, we cannot see it. The signal is coming at 10 power minus 21, 22, we can see it. So that's what is the whole idea. So the first gravitational wave detection happened in the year 2015. Einstein told the gravitational wave exists in the year 1916, and after 100 years after that, we got the first observation in our detectors. The first event what we saw, it was GW 150914. The gravitational waves are named in this particular format, called GW followed by YY MM DD, where YY stands for the year, MM stands for the month, DD stands for the date. So GW 150914 means that it was detected in the 2015 year, in the month 09, that is the August, and on the 14th date. So 14 August 2015 was the first event which the LIGO detector observed. And so why we were able to observe this signal? Because this is this particular colored blue one. This red and blue are the detector curve. This is the Hanford detector's noise curve, red one, and the Livingston detector's noise curve is the blue one. So the signal curves are, signal strength is presented here. This particular blue one, the thick line. So you can see the signal enters into this detector at this particular 30 hertz frequency, and it lasts up to some thousands of frequency, and then it goes out of the detector. So we can see it up to this particular thing. So we also saw one more gravitational wave detection, GW 151226, in our detector. This was seen in the December month, because 2015, 12 is for the December, and on the 26th date. So we got two observations in the 2015 year. This observation came in August, but this was analyzed and it was published only in the 2016 year, in the February month, because this was a very big announcement to be made, and they took their time and they announced it. And if any signal, any gravitational signal, if it comes below the detector noise curve, we cannot see it. The signal strength has to be above the detector noise curve. And the GW 1509, what we observed, it lasted only for like few seconds. But the GW 151226, it lasted for about 1.5 seconds. This was little long-lasting signal. This was little bit short-lasting signal. And there was one more detection in the month October, LVT, but this they called it as trigger, because they couldn't prove that this is a genuine gravitational wave signal. This could be due to some disturbance which got created in the instrument or in our Earth. So this was not considered as a signal. So I would like to now show you this animation. You can see it. So this is what it happened. There were two black holes which were orbiting in a very different distant past, and they kept coming close to each other, and they were inspiraling. At one particular point, they came so close to each other that they merged, and the gravitational wave emission happened. The gravitational wave emission happened due to their orbital motion, due to their inspiral phase, and also due to when they merged with each other. And the theory suggests that so this is what happened. The actual gravitational wave got released from this two black holes merging in a very distant part, some millions of years. Then this gravitational wave traveled towards our Earth, and finally it entered into our Earth in the year 2015, and our detectors were ready and they could observe it. And you may ask how we know that the gravitational wave signal, this simple wave which we got, is from a black hole, and all those things. The theory of gravitational waves, when people have done calculations, it says that the gravitational wave frequency will be twice the frequency of this binary system. That is, if the two stars are orbiting at 2 hertz frequency, that is, in 1 second, if they are orbiting about each other 2 times, then the gravitational wave frequency will be 4. That is, gravitational frequency will be twice the binary frequency. If the binary frequency is 10 hertz, the gravitational wave frequency will be 20 hertz. If the binary frequency is 30 hertz, the gravitational wave frequency will be 60 hertz. Whatever is the binary star's frequency, the gravitational frequency will be twice of that. So that is something helps us in knowing what actually happened in the system, because here we get is only signal. We try to see whether it was a black hole, whether it was which type of thing, what was their distance. All that information we try to get through this signal and this frequency plot which is shown here. So there are also some cases where there is rotating neutron star, from that also produces gravitational wave. And for rotating neutron star, the gravitational waves which is emitted, that is also 2 times the rotation frequency. So this is the catalog of gravitational waves what we observed, the GW150914, GW15226, and these are different. The first event that we observed, the black hole merger, the first black hole was of 36 solar mass and the second black hole was of 29 solar mass, and they merged into together, and the final black hole which got formed was of 62 solar mass, and the 3 solar mass got emitted in the form of gravitational waves, and which traveled so far and we detected, and the source was located at 400 megaparsec distance, and the signal lasted for 0.2 seconds, and this was detected in the LIGO detector. There was one more observation called GW170814 in the 2017 year. This was also a black hole merger. The black hole mass was 31, another black hole mass was 25. This was located at 540 megaparsec, but this was detected in LIGO detector and the Virgo detector. Virgo detector is located in the Europe, in the Italy city. And the Nobel Prize in 2007 went to Rainer Weiss, Barry C. Barish, and Kip Thorne, because they were involved in theoretical contributions and also bringing up this LIGO detector, which led to the observation of gravitational wave. The 2017 Nobel Prize went to this, but 3 people, in which Kip Thorne has a contribution for his theoretical works, and Rainer Weiss and Barry C. Barish have contributed to the making of the LIGO detector for observing it. So there was an interesting gravitational wave event GW170817 which was seen, and this particular event was a neutron star merger, the first neutron star merger that we saw in the gravitational wave. And this is the frequency plot and the time. That is the frequency that we saw in our detector. This is the LIGO data, Livingston data, and the Virgo data. The signal came in the Italy, and after 22 seconds it was seen in the LIGO Livingston, and after 3 milliseconds it was seen in the Hanford. The Livingston Hanford detectors are in the US, so within the 3 milliseconds they were seen. But in the Virgo detector, Virgo it came first, after 22 seconds in the Livingston, after 3 milliseconds in the Hanford. So after this detection was seen in the gravitational waves, people came to know that this was looking like a neutron star merger. When 2 black holes merge, you don't get any electromagnetic signals, you don't get optical light, you don't get radio emission or any X-ray emission. But when 2 neutrons are merged, there are chances that you will get some different emission. So immediately after this merger was seen, we had this Fermi telescope and integral telescope, the gamma ray telescopes which are orbiting around our Earth. And within the few milliseconds of this LIGO detection being seen, they detected gamma ray burst, which got produced from this merging of the neutron star. So this is what something which could have happened, this animation. So the 2 stars, or the 2 neutron stars orbited, came very close to each other, and then finally they merged, and then we had a gamma ray burst. That is, gamma ray got emitted, and that was seen by the Fermi and integral telescope which were orbiting around our Earth. And the gravitational waves which got produced, these ripples, that was seen over our LIGO. First the gravitational wave got emitted, and immediately in few milliseconds we had a gamma ray emission from this particular thing which was seen by our gamma ray telescopes. So after this data in our gravitational wave detector and gamma ray telescope noted, now what the community did is that they informed all the laboratories and the astronomy laboratories throughout the Earth that they should try and attempt to see if there are any optical, electromagnetic, radio, and X-ray emission from the source. And these were all the telescopes throughout our Earth which were involved in it, somewhere in space, somewhere in Earth, and all were told that kindly analyze the sky and let's see what we get. And on that particular day, everybody tried to analyze it, and the LIGO detector had seen something, the Virgo detector had seen something, and the Fermi telescope had seen something. And this is the particular graph which you can plot, which you can see. And This is the green line. What it represents? It is the LIGO says that in the sky, in this patch, you should see it, and the integral and Fermi gamma ray observation says that in this patch of sky, you should try to see the observation. The overlapping of LIGO and the Fermi patch in the sky is where every telescope started looking. The first telescope which spotted this thing was the SWAP Supernova Survey Telescope, and it spotted this particular gravitational wave detection. After the gravitational wave detection happened, after 10 hours of that, we got an optical detection by this SWAP Supernova Survey, and and they could find it. And also there were different telescopes, SSS, DLT40, Vista, Master, who also could see in the another 1.5 hours after first observation by SWAP Supernova Survey. So this was a joint effort which was going. We saw in the gravitational wave, we saw in the gamma ray by the Fermian integral telescope. Then we made our all optical and other telescopes to locate inside, to search in the sky. And in 10 hours time at the night, we could spot from where this spot the particular source in the sky too. So this was the optical telescope data from year 2009 to 2014. There was no small dot present in this particular location. But on that particular night, on the August 2017, the optical telescopes could spot a small source emerging there, which was giving some emission in the optical wavelength, the visible wavelength. And that particular thing was completely matching with the place which was suggested by LIGO, Virgo, and other gravitational wave detector observation. And this particular thing, the optical telescopes could spot there. So here there were two neutron stars which cannot be seen in optical, but when they merged, they resulted in some optical emission which was spotted. Also, the X-ray telescopes which are put into Hunt, they also could spot after 9 days of the observation. The X-ray emission, when the two neutron stars merged, the optical emission happened immediately, but the X-ray emission came only after 9 days. And that was also spotted by the Chandra X-ray telescope, which was also doing Hunt. And even in the radio telescopes which were put into Hunt and see the source, they also spotted, but they, after 18 days of the neutron star merging, radio emission came from that particular source. And after 18 days, they started seeing the radio emission, this particular small point. Is anybody has commented anything? Okay. So I'll wind up in some time, just some 5 or 10 more minutes. So the timeline of various observation is this. This was an amazing observation that we did for the neutron star merger event. It was seen in the gravitational wave, then it was seen in the gamma ray, then immediately the optical telescopes could see, the X-ray telescopes could see, the infrared emission happened, radio emission happened, and it was a multi-wavelength study, multi-messenger study. In different wavelengths we could see in the electromagnetic counterpart, and also we could see it in the gravitational wave. So it was a multi-messenger signal, a signal which came in gravitational wave, also in the electromagnetic counterpart. So this kind of studies are called as multi-messenger astronomy, where the gravitational wave detector sees the gravitational waves and the electromagnetic telescope see in different bands. So this is the data combining the 3 different telescopes, some observed in UV, some observed in optical, some observed in infrared. This is put together that we completely got the different data. And through this data, revealed us that different elements got formed. When the neutron star merged, it was completely filled of neutrons. And when they merged, the neutrons led to formation of some elements. And that element formation signals could be spotted in this spectrum, which was done after data analysis. So as I told you that when our universe started, we had only hydrogen and helium atom. And our star formation happens in this gas clouds where hydrogen and helium is present. And in our sun-like stars, we can get elements up to carbon only. But in our neutron star and other stars, we get elements up to iron. But the higher elements which are present above iron and others, those kind of elements are formed only in the neutron star merger. They are not formed in any other processes. The gold that we see, the gold that we wear, that would have surely got formed in a neutron star merger, because there is no other process in the universe in which gold can get formed. When two neutrons are merged together, only there sufficient amount of neutrons were there to form heavy elements. And this heavy element, when they get formed, we can see their signals in the optical spectrum and also through various other means. So when our universe started, the Big Bang only gave us hydrogen and helium. Stars are the laboratories where element formation happens. In sun-like stars, moderate stars, we get element formation up to carbon. in little bigger star we get element formation up to iron, Fe, and there are other events in the universe in which we get heavy element formation, and the most of the heavier elements in the periodic table that we see, that definitely have got formed naturally by neutron-neutron star merger. The gold which we wear in our earth, the gold that we see, are definitely formed in the neutron star merger. So this particular thing that we saw, neutron-neutron star merging and heavy element formation signals in the electromagnetic spectrum, was a strong support of the theoretical studies that the heavy element formation has definitely happened in neutron star mergers. So this was a very big discovery. We got observational evidence for heavy element formation which is happening in our universe. So the heavy elements that we see has happened in neutron star mergers. That's what I want to say from this slide. So after this, did we see any other particular interesting event? Yes, in the last year 2020, we had seen a black hole and neutron star merger in our LIGO detector and the Virgo detector. LIGO is there in USA, Virgo is there in this particular thing, what I call Europe. And we had seen a merger event in which there was a black hole. Two events we have seen, GW 200105. This happened in January on the 5th date. This happened in January 2020, but happened on the 15th January. 15 January 2020, 5 January 2020. And the mass of black hole is supposed to be 7 point solar mass, and the neutron star mass is 1.7 to 2.2 solar mass. For this particular event, the black hole is little bit smaller in size. It can be from 3.6 solar mass to 7 solar mass, and the neutron star is 1.2 to 2.2 solar mass. So these two particular detections have been reported, and this paper got published only in the last month, in the June month. And as of now, we have strong evidence that the black hole neutron star merger has also been spotted. And Kagara is a detector which has come up in Japan, and in our India also there is an upcoming detector called as LIGO India, and it is going to come up in Maharashtra, and it will be active by 2025. And we also will be observing this much amazing and interesting cosmic events in our India. So what is there for the future? So what I had to, this is the plot of noise curves. The LIGO detector's noise curve is plotted here. This is the frequency in the x-axis. This is the strain in the y-axis. That is the noise magnitude, you can say it. So the LIGO detector can see noise curve is present here. I told you that only when the signal strength is above this noise, we can see it. So all the black hole observations that we see in LIGO should have magnitude of 10 power minus 21 in the strength, and frequency above 30 hertz, because LIGO detector's noise curve, you see, it is starting from 30 hertz. So only above 30 hertz we can see in the LIGO detector. LIGO detector cannot give us observations below 30 hertz. That is, when the two black holes have come very close to each other and they are orbiting quite fast, only then we can see. 30 hertz means in 1 second they are orbiting 30 times. Only then we can start seeing them. So in the LIGO detector, we can see only the late in spiral. We cannot see when they are very far from each other and slowly in spiraling. That part we cannot see in the LIGO. The LIGO detector, we see only the late in spiral. In future, we are going to have Einstein telescope, Virgo, advanced Virgo, and other future detectors in which we can see even below 10 hertz frequency, and we can see even lower, and these noise curves are lying very low. So it means we can see even signals which are 10 power minus 24 in magnitude, which LIGO cannot see. So the gravitational waves from rotating neutron star possibly will be seen in the future in this Einstein telescope. This Einstein telescope's arm length will be 10 kilometer in length. In the LIGO detector, what I told was only 4 kilometer, the distance between the laser arms. But here it will be 10 kilometer. This will be very massive, very vast, and it can detect even the smallest gravitational wave signals which in the future. So we also are having some space detectors which are coming up called as LISA. From our Earth, we cannot see below 0 hertz, because in our Earth there is a lot of noise which is present due to the terrestrial things which are going on. So sitting on the Earth, we cannot see anything below 10 hertz. We can see only after 10 hertz on our Earth. If you want to see something below 0 hertz, we should keep our detectors on the space. And for that, we are having the LISA detector. The LISA detector will be same interferometer detector, but it will be kept in the space. And through this LISA detector, we can see the signals which cannot be seen on Earth, the low frequency signals. In the Earth, we can able to see only about 10 hertz. In the space, we can see even below that. And we can see all slow in spiral, and even when the stars are little bit distant apart and they are orbiting, we can see them. And there are also proposals for having a pulsar timing array and new detectors which can even see frequencies 10 power minus 8 hertz. Those smallest ones too. So this is the gravitational wave spectrum which I wanted to show. We have terrestrial interferometers, the laser ones, which can see the signals, the gravitational signals which are of few millisecond duration and which are about 10 hertz, the gravitational wave detectors on Earth. The space ones can see the signals which are hours and seconds of duration, longer duration signals, and which can have a low frequency, 10 power minus 4 to 10 power 0 hertz. And we are having pulsar timing array, some future detectors which can see 10 power minus 10 to 10 power minus 4 hertz gravitational wave, and they can detect the signals which are of years and years of duration. And in future we will be able to see supermassive black hole merger signals. We will be also able to see slowly rotating star signals. We will be also able to see gravitational wave signals produced from supernova. As I told, collapsing star also produce gravitational wave. And in future, supernova collapse or any particular collapse happening, those signals also we can able to see. So thank you for keeping patience and listening to it. You can have your questions now.
Yes, thank you, sir. It was a really great talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, so first question. Yes, there is an echo.
Because I guess you haven't used your earphones, Ayush. So
No,
thank
I
you.
have a earphones. Yeah. Okay, you
Okay.
can go on. Yeah, I can share the. Just one second.
You don't need. Okay, so you can post all the questions in the chat
Yeah.
box.
Yeah.
And thank you, sir. That was a very informative talk. And first of all, if someone having a question, so he can unmute himself or herself and ask the question.
Yes, I have pasted the link of all the questions on the chat box. So yeah, you guys can unmute and just ask your questions.
Ayush, I cannot open the link. You can directly paste the questions here in the chat
Okay.
box. Yes, Ranjan, go on.
Yeah, so I had a question. You talked about the conservation of magnetic flux. Like
Yeah.
we, the functioning of the Earth's magnetic field, like it's still an open problem. So how can we like theoretically say that okay, magnetic flux is conserved?
In any particular process, the magnetic field is not fully conserved, but that was a rough estimate to show you that because in your school days you have read some equations of flux conservation. I just wanted to take those equations and show you that if flux is conserved, if there was a big star, sun size, and that had a magnetic field. Now it's a small star of 15-kilometer mass size, and now that has some magnetic field. How strong the magnetic field value can be? This was that for a comparison purpose. But the magnetic field of neutrons, are how it is generated, how it is sustained, how it degrades over the time. That is still an open question, and people are working over it. We don't have an exact answer over it.
Okay, but like, can we predict that how much it will drop?
Yeah, we have good estimates. The magnetic field of neutron star is 10 power 15 or 10 power 14 Gauss that we see. They are very strong magnetic fields that we see.
And the parent star, like that.
Parent star, as of now, I don't have any estimate, but I feel whatever that is, but this is much higher than that.
Okay.
Around a lot of orders higher than that, because the parent star size was hundreds of kilometers, and now it has become 15 kilometers.
Yeah.
Neutron star. So you can imagine the radius has decreased by a big amount. So the magnetic field has to increase by that much amount. The magnetic fields are so strong. That's why we get the radio emissions also through them, but not with any other source.
And what about the deadline? Like why does below that there isn't any? Like we can't detect any emission. Is
the
there
emission? Why they can't detect any emission from
Yeah.
that? So if you see, there are some separate lines also. So you can see this is one magnetic field line, 10 power 14 Gauss, 10 power 12 Gauss. What actually happens is that when the neutron stars are formed, they will be very rapidly rotating and they will have strong magnetic fields when they are born here. But over the year, because this is like a magnetic dipole which is rotating, any magnetic dipole which is rotating, it will emit energy.
Yeah.
That's basic physics.
Yeah,
And due to which their rotation speed decreases, and though they start their life in the middle of this chart, slowly they come down. Their magnetic field also decreases over the year. Their rotation period also decreases over the year, and they enter into this particular zone called as death line, where after they enter, they're spinning so slowly, and the magnetic field is also so less that the radio emission is not happening. So there is no emission from them. But there is some surprising thing also that we see is that sometimes they will be in a binary system. They will have a companion, and the companion, when it undergoes a red giant phase, its outer layer starts falling on this particular neutron star, due to which it again starts rotating rapidly, and then it comes out from this graveyard back into this particular line again.
But shouldn't it be a gradient kind of and not a like continuous?
So the particular things which is marked here in the red, right? These are
Yeah,
called as recycled pulsars or the recycled neutron star, because they went into the graveyard and then they have again started emitting back again, because they were in a binary system and their companion gave some mass to it, and then the mass went and fell on them. They gained some angular momentum because of the mass which was falling on them brought some angular momentum and imparted to them, and due to which they again started rotating rapidly, and they came out of from this graveyard to again back to this normal thing. These are called as recycled pulsar, the red ones inside this ones.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have passed 1 hour. So, sir, is there any time crunch that you are having? Otherwise, we can.
I have no time crunch. If you guys have anything, I'm free to answer for any much
Okay.
time.
Okay. So, yes, someone is having question, I guess.
Sir, am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
I have quite a few questions. Can I ask them continuously?
Yeah, sure. You can ask.
Maybe you can. Okay. Whoever this person is, please stick to one question at a time. We will take the other questions at the end.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go question after question. First question is, you said the white dwarfs radiate their temperature over billions of years. And I read that when they finally give out all their heat, they become black dwarfs. So what black dwarfs explode, because since they radiate everything they've got, the gravity will try to crush them. So won't they become a black hole or explode?
No. Why I want to say, once a white dwarf has formed, it is being balanced by the electron degeneracy pressure of the electron degeneracy pressure is balancing the white dwarf. And the thing is that when the white dwarf got formed from, suppose our sun-like star is there, and at the end of the life it will become a white dwarf. There is some heat, heat and energy which is present on its surface, which it is slowly radiating away. It is very warm. It is got heated up, and now it is radiating slowly over the years. But the equilibrium is maintained not by the gas pressure or anything. It is maintained by the electron degeneracy pressure. The electron degeneracy pressure is balancing the gravity, so it will be stable. Though it becomes a black dwarf after losing all its warmness, but it will still be stable because the gravity is balanced still by the electron. Interior, the electrons are there. The degeneracy pressure is balancing the gravity. There will be no problem in a black dwarf being sustaining. But they will lose their energy, the warmness. Suppose you keep a hot object for years and years, what it will do? It will lose its heat, but internally it is still stable. That's what happens here.
Oh, okay, sir. And I have my next question is, one minute. Are black holes spherical in shape?
Are black holes
Spherical in shape.
the black holes are actually not spherical in shape. The rotating ones, the rotating black holes, the black holes which rotate are actually not spherical in shape. This is a non-rotating black hole diagram called as Schwarzschild black hole. Whenever you do physics or do any particular thing, you model a non-rotating object, then you model a rotating object, and you add more complexity to it. So the non-rotating black hole, if you take, or a non-rotating star or a non-rotating Earth, is spherical in shape. But if it rotates, it cannot be spherical in shape. Even for our Earth, it's oblate in shape because of rotation.
Will it be ellipsoid?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Sir, I have another question.
One question, please. We can answer the remaining at the end. There are other questions as well. Okay. So there is one question from Devang. He is asking that you said that we don't have any upper limit of mass of neutron stars, but sir, according to Tolman-Oppenheimer Volkoff limit, it gives a limit of 2.1 solar masses. Can you please comment on this?
The thing is that when you want to find, what Chandrasekhar did is that Chandrasekhar, when he worked on this particular thing for white dwarfs, a white dwarf is a system which is made up of electron gas, completely filled of electrons. The electrons drip out of the atom, and there's a sea of electrons. And then you assume a sea of electrons. You assume the electron matter, and then you do the calculation, and you get a maximum mass limit. For the neutron star, we have a Tolman-Volkov limit. For that, you have to assume what is the matter present in the neutron star. If you assume it is made up of completely neutrons, it is made up of neutrons plus hyperons, and it may also have some other different particles. The exact composition of neutron star is not known clear to us. And the matter which is present inside the neutron star, we have some complex theoretical models called the mean field models and other models, due to which the exact equation of state, for example, we know that sun is having hydrogen and helium and some other thing. We can apply ideal gas equation of state or a real gas equation of state. But for the neutrons, the exact composition is not known, and the exact equation of state for that matter is not known, due to which, depending on, if somebody chooses one particular equation of state to describe that matter, they will get 2.1. If somebody uses another, they get 2.5. That's why the equation of state is not clearly known. The composition is not clearly known. So we have a limit, something from 2 to 3 solar mass, something like that. Exact is not known as of now. We hope that the observations which we are getting from gravitational waves and the future observations, from which if we will be able to completely pinpoint what will be the exact mass, after which a neutron star will not be stable and the black hole mass region will start.
Thank you, sir. Next is Jyotiraditya. He is having question: how do we study for the magnetic fields and their effects for neutron stars which are so far away from us?
Yeah, the neutron stars are very far, and as I told that the two basic quantities that we measure from the neutron star are, because the neutron star is giving the radio pulses through its magnetic axis, and since it is rotating, the pulses we get in the form of pulses. We get now a pulse, then after 1 second we get the pulse, then after another 1 second we get the pulse. That's the data we get. And using these radio pulses that we get, we try to know what is the spin period of the neutron star. The data we get for the neutron star is at what how the radio pulses are coming, and with the radio pulses we know what is the spin period and what is the spin period change. And through that, there is some theory work is also there. Some theoretical formulas are there which relates the spin, magnetic field, and the spin period change. And using those theoretical estimates only, we say if a pulsar is having this much particular period and this much particular period change, its magnetic field will be this much. Observationally, we don't know what is the neutron star's magnetic field. Observationally, we only know what is the neutron star spin and the spin period change, P and the P dot. Using the P and P dot and some theoretical formula that we have for a rotating neutron star, what will be its magnetic field related to P and P dot, we get the magnetic field values. The magnetic field values are theoretically obtained.
Okay, thank you. Next is Muzammil. He is asking how neutron stars produces magnetic field, because they are made up of neutrons. Since they are made up of neutrons, how can they produce magnetic field?
The neutron star, the actual structure of a neutron star is much more complex. Inside a neutron star, you have different matter. For example, the neutron star is majorly composed of neutrons. It has some composition of protons, and it has composition of various different particles. It may have some quark content, it may have some other content, and also there are some works which have shown that the neutron star has some superfluid core. The superconducting core is there, right? The superfluid core that is also present inside the neutron star, and those particular superfluid core which is present inside the neutron star, they are only the ones which are trying to give its magnetic field and those kind of things. So that's what.
Okay, thank you. Next, again Devang. Is there any limit as per time period beyond which we have found no pulsars?
Time period, yes. Actually, what I told is that whatever I have shown here, this is every pulsar that we know. The pulsars, the time period is like 10 second here. These ones are millisecond pulsar, the 10 power minus 3 around ones. This one is pulsars which are having spin period in 10. We don't see any pulsar which is having period of 100 seconds or 1 year and all that. So what is this 10 second means is that it does rotation. Its rotation period is 10 second. That is it is rotating very fast. The millisecond ones are rotating very fast, and these are rotating quite slow, the ones which are having 10. we don't see slow rotating pulsars beyond this. Most of the pulsars data is between 10 to 10 power minus 3 seconds. If it rotates slowly, we may not get this radio emission from them to us, to reach us.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Shubham. He is asking how did they figure out that electromagnetic radiation is from the gravitational wave source? I mean, how they located the gravitational wave source?
Okay, the thing is that what I told you was that first the LIGO detectors which were operating, they detected some signals in the gravitational wave, and there are computers which are continuously real-time monitoring. Whenever any signal kind of disturbance they see, they monitor it, and the real time they give alerts to the scientists that okay, we have detected something, and then they analyze to see that whether it's a neutron star or black hole. The computer itself does that. They have algorithms and templates. They have already neutron star templates of gravitational wave, neutron star black hole templates of gravitational wave, black hole templates. Every template is already ready, and that has been continuously being analyzed. That whenever you detect it, and as soon as they detect that there is a neutron star thing, and the LIGO detector is located in this particular region, another one is located in this particular region. So seeing the way the gravitational wave has come, we can say from which part of the sky the gravitational wave came, and clubbing this data, they try to see from which patch of sky that came. And so this is the diagram which I showed, which I will tell it one more time clearly. So the LIGO detector said is that in our night sky, analyze in this particular patch, the green one. LIGO plus Virgo put together, this dark green patch. The LIGO told this light green patch could be the one. When the LIGO and the Virgo detector, the Europe one is there, when they combined together, the sky localization got minimized. Instead of this two particular light green patch, it became this dark green patch. And the Fermi and the integral telescope, which were there, the gamma ray detection, they told the source could be in this particular blue region. The overlapping of the LIGO detections and this Fermi gamma ray detection, in that particular region, the optical telescopes were scanning. And it was very hard task because even a small patch in this particular region in the sky is much hard to scan. And they were ready, the telescopes were ready in the morning, and at the night they started scanning. And after 10 hours of the gravitational waves being seen, the first observation was done. It's just like localization, from which direction it would have come. LIGO told some direction, some patch, Virgo told some patch, and the Fermi telescope and the integral telescope told some patch of sky where it would have come, and the joint where this overlap is there the optical telescope scan. And we know that these observations came from that particular thing because suddenly there is a particular thing. For example, this particular thing from year 2009 to 14, there was no electromagnetic observation from that part of sky, and suddenly we see that there is on that particular day there is a optical thing which has started coming from there. So we know that this particular thing is corresponding to the gravitational wave that we see. The gravitational wave detector that we have on our Earth are static. We cannot rotate it like the telescopes. This is static. This is 4 kilometer arm length. This is static. This is completely localized. You cannot rotate it. But the electromagnetic telescopes, you can rotate it and completely scan the sky. So that's what it was done. They gave some clue, and then in that patch of night sky, the telescope scanned and they could spot a optical dot. And then in that particular patch, we could see X-ray, radio, and a lot of various emission.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Next is Jyotiraditya. He is asking if we cannot directly look at a neutron star, but only its pulsating and gravitational activities, how can we be sure that we are not looking at a possible quark star? I mean, what other properties do we look for while trying to find a quark star?
Okay, so as I told you, I would like to state one more time that our Earth is orbiting around the Sun. That also gives gravitational wave. There may be two normal main sequence stars going about each other orbiting. In lot of binary stars are there. They also produce gravitational wave, but those are weak in magnitude to see. So only the powerful sources that we can see are that of the neutron star. And since in our Earth we can see only about 10 Hertz. Below 10 Hertz we cannot see, because below 10 Hertz we have Earth-based distortion and noises. Only about 10 Hertz we can see. We can see only the late in spiral. And when we see this gravitational wave data or the pulsar data from any neutron star, we can say that it's from neutron star, but we cannot say that the neutron star has a quark content or not in it. For that, we need much more data. Just now the data has started coming in gravitational wave. Just now the data has started coming in the pulsar data, radio data we are having from lot of years. The gravitational data has just now started coming. In future, there are chances that we can differentiate which is a neutron star or whether it's a neutron star which has a quark core or it's a fully quark star in the future. And my work is based on that. In my work, what I have done is that when a neutron star becomes a quark star, what will be the possible gravitational wave signature from that I have calculated, and we have published some papers. And in future, we may get some observations which will help us to say that, oh, when a neutron star becomes a quark star, this type of signal was seen, and yeah, there could be a quark star formation which is happening in our universe somewhere.
Okay, thank you. So there are no more questions in the chat box. I have one question which is not relevant to the to this talk, but relevant to the evolution of stars. So can I
Yes,
ask
say.
that?
Yeah, sure.
So I read somewhere that for globular clusters, there is some property that we get, like some importance of the slope of the giant branch and asymptotic giant branch. So if you can provide some source, or like if you can guide me about that.
Yeah, sure. I will try to email you anything over it, and I can send you something later to that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. So
Thank
hope
you.
it's clear. If anybody has any question, you can ask. Even if it's any silly or naive, it's okay. It's not a
Sir,
problem.
I have one more question, sir.
Yeah.
Can you explain each quantity in the quadruple formula?
Each quantity in the quadruple formula. Yeah, sure. So actually, these are tensors. Tensors you will learn quite late in your life, in your BSMS program. So what actually this formula says is that this is distance of the source. The more far is the source, the lesser will be the magnitude of the gravitational wave. And this is double derivative of the quadrupole moment. And Qij is called as the quadrupole, and that is equal to integration of rho, Ri, Rj, and dq bar. And here rho is the density of the system, Ri and Rj are position coordinates of the system. In simplified terms, as of now, because you don't know the tensor. So for any system whose density is changing, if you have a neutron star, and if it's undergoing some density change inside it, it will emit gravitational wave. And in case of for this particular example that you see here, binary in spiral, when the two stars are orbiting about each other, in that particular case, it's the distance Ri and Rj, the radius, which is changing because they are orbiting about each other. So gravitational wave comes. In case of a rotating neutron star, also it's something similar. And I wanted to say a few things which are that if a spherically symmetric neutron star, however fast it rotates, you will never get a gravitational wave. A spherically symmetric any star, either a neutron star or a white dwarf or any main sequence star, however fast it rotates, it's never going to produce gravitational wave. To get a gravitational wave from rotating star, it must have some deformation. It should have a triaxial shape. Only then you can get gravitational wave. Same with collapse. If there is a star which is collapsing after the supernova and it is forming a white dwarf, neutron star, or a black hole, the collapse will give only gravitational wave only if it is not spherically symmetric. A spherically symmetric collapse doesn't give gravitational wave.
Oh, okay, sir. I have one more question.
Yeah.
I'm working on this. Is it for I've tried this, but I've tried this and I've achieved some success in this. So can you tell me whether my approach is valid or not? I've used Schrodinger equation to analyze all the properties that can be analyzed using the general relativity, and to some extent, instead of saying extent, to some approximation, my analysis works. Is it valid? Is this method correct or not?
The thing is that you are saying you used Schrodinger wave equation, you did some analysis, and then you matched with the general relativity, and you want to know whether it is right. The quantum mechanics, Schrodinger equation is valid for quantum mechanics, and general relativity is valid for this gravitational regime, where we don't see quantum effects. So I would like to see what you have done. You can contact me later. You know my email. I will post it in the chat box. You can write to me, and we can meet up in the meet, and you can show me. I can guide you there properly whether you are going in the right path or is there anything okay or not okay with your approach. You can discuss it there.
Okay, sir. Thank
I'll
you.
be happy to do that.
Thank you. Now I have one more question. Is it possible to do two PhDs at the same time, like one in astrophysics and another in cosmology?
The thing is, you can do two PhD in the two different. You are free to do as many number of PhD. You can do one in astrophysics after 4 years. Then again, you can start in cosmology. You can do or without doing PhD itself, once you have developed in astrophysics, you gain some knowledge, gain some experience in your postdoc or in your further research, you can switch to some other field without even doing PhD. PhD is a phase where you learn a field, learn a subject, you learn the theoretical tools, you learn the computation part, or you learn a lab instrument, or you learn the telescopes, the observation, and those kind of things. And the research keeps evolving over the years. Not like whatever you have done in the PhD, you stick to that whole throughout your life. Something related to that you do in your postdoctoral research, something related to that you do in your faculty position when you become, or people keep evolving over the years. The research, same thing you cannot do, it gets boring after a while. You explore the related topics. Sometimes some people have explored very different topics, like from astrophysics to cosmology or even to high energy. Whatever interests you, if you can do learn the theory, learn the computation part, learn its basics, learn the literature, read through the papers, and then you are fine enough to switch over the fields as you want. There is no strict distinction is there.
Thank you, sir.
Round.
Yes, sure.
So radiation is always, I mean, light radiation is always parallel to acceleration of charged particles, right? So in pulsars, why is radio waves said to be emitted along magnetic pole instead of parallel to it?
Yeah, so wait. So what actually is happening here is that when a neutron star is formed, it is not completely neutron, it is majority of the neutron, but there are electrons and other particles also present in it. And at the surface, the electrons which are present, electron is a charged particle which gets accelerated along this magnetic field lines. It goes from here, then it comes here, it goes from here, it comes here. That's kind of thing it does. So when the electron is getting accelerated, any accelerated charged particle, here it will lead to this emission of radio photons. And that's why the emission happens along this magnetic field line from this particular.
So it accelerates near the, I mean, at the top of the pole, right? So only then it can go parallel, I mean, along that pole.
Yeah, the pole is here. The pole is here. The north and south is along the magnetic field. The rotation axis is this one, blue one, but the magnetic axis is along this direction. And the magnetic axis is there, right? That has to face the Earth. Suppose we are sitting below the rotation axis, here down, directly down. In our Earth is located here. Then as it is rotating, then whenever this thing comes towards us, only then we can see it. Whenever the pulsar rotates and it points towards us, we'll be able to see it. It is rotating in this direction like this.
So then the particle will be, it will be accelerating even along the equator, right? The equator of that its path. Then light will be parallel to, it will be perpendicular to that pole also.
The poles are here, I'm saying, north and south here, in this direction here.
I'll mail that, so I think I can't explain that clearly.
Okay. You can email me anything you have. I can just let you know. Or there are more resources on this where you can read and also can know it better. There are very simple resources available on it which I can send you about how this emission is happening here and why actually the emissions are happening. What are the modes of emission? These are easy to read things. You can just explore it, or you can ask me if any doubt later.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so if you are not having any more questions, maybe we can end the session here. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending the talk, and thank you, sir. It was a very informative talk, and we had a very interesting Q&A session at the end. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me for this talk. Yeah, thank you guys. And whoever made that poster, it was very nice.
Okay, shout out to Ayush who made that post.